Israel was on the brink of a civil war. Saul was the king, and yet David had been anointed as his successor by Samuel. Saul was in command of all of the great armies, and yet there were many soldiers who had gone to David's side, who were there to fight with him. Saul was insane. He had become violent and irrational, and David had to flee into the desert. And there in the desert, his faith was wearing thin. He was not sure what God had in store for him. What could save this nation? Friendship. You see, Jonathan, who was Saul's son, was known as someone who was closer than a brother to David. Years before, when David had slain Goliath and Saul had brought this youngster into his home, he and Jonathan had become fast friends. In fact, they had made a covenant they would be friends forever. And now that David is out in the desert with his faith fraying, not knowing what to do, we see Jonathan who shows up. And Scripture says Jonathan helped David find strength in God. Isn't that beautiful? Do you have friends that help you find strength in God? Or are you a friend that helps others find strength in God? Friends will help us renew our strength. They do this by recognizing our need. We all live such busy lives, don't we? And sometimes it's easy to overlook our friends who might be in need, or maybe we're in need. It looks like everyone else is so busy around us. And yet we need to recognize that there are those who are in need, and many times they are our friends. This Mother's Day, I think about my own mom. And I think about how she taught me to always watch for those who were in need. I remember one Mother's Day, my mom that afternoon disappeared, and I wondered, why'd Mom leave? Did she want to get away from us kids? We had been real nice to her that day. But she came back after a while, and I remember asking her, Mom, where did you go? Where have you been? And she said, you remember Miss Amy? Yeah, I knew Miss Amy. Miss Amy was a young woman in our church. She said, you remember Miss Amy is expecting a baby? I said, yes, I remember that. She said, what you don't know, Nelson, is that Miss Amy has lost her baby. And it's a very sad day for her today. And what you don't know is way before you were born and way before any of your sisters were born, I was to have a baby that never came. I know what this feels like, and I know what it's like to have this deep pain. And so anytime I know of someone who has lost a baby, I go to them and I sit with them and I cry with them. My mother was teaching me that we should take our pains and that we should pay attention to others who are in need and know that there are those around us, even in our happiest days, that sometimes need us to be their friend. I remember when I was a teenager, my mom told me one time, she said, Nelson, we need to go visit the Smiths. And I'm like, okay, why do we need to go see the Smiths? She said, well, Reggie's your age. They're very new to our church. You've met him a couple of times. I said, yeah, I know Reggie. I've met him. And she said, well, he's sick. He has mono. And she said, let's go over there. We're going to take him some ice cream, and I'm going to visit with Miss Smith, and you're going to visit with Reggie. And I thought, well, he's not my friend. Why should I go over there and just visit this guy because he's sick? I didn't realize that I'd be visiting sick folks the rest of my life. My mom was teaching me, even when I was in middle school, to pay attention to folks who are hurting. She said, Reggie's probably really bored, and no one's coming around right now. So I went over and we sat and we talked, and guess what? Reggie became a good friend of mine. All because we reached out. You see, friends go to friends who are in need. I just love this story of David and Jonathan. When David's out in the desert and Jonathan leaves the palace, he leaves the security of his father's house, and he goes out and he just goes to be with his friend David. Presence It is what we can give to our friends. It's a big part of friendship. One of my mentors in ministry is Dr. Chuck Bugg. Dr. Bugg taught me preaching at one point, and he has been a professor. He's been pastor of a lot of very prominent churches throughout the Southeast. And I remember Dr. Bugg telling us a story about when he was pastor of First Baptist Church of Augusta. He had gone there and was there for about 2 months when his 10-year-old son, David, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He didn't have any friends around because he was brand new to that church. He really didn't know many people in the church. It was a very large, prestigious church, and he was supposed to be their pastor and be strong for them. And Chuck was sitting in his office one day just thinking, I don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm going to lead this church. I can't get through this. And there was a knock on his door. And a fellow named Tracy Tooney walked in. Tracy was a pastor in Augusta as well. He was there to visit Chuck, who was new to town. He came in and introduced himself, and Chuck looked up and thought, I don't know who this guy is. And then he realized that Tracy was probably as opposite of him as he could be. Chuck was pastor of a very large, very prominent church. He had a huge staff of folks to help him. Tracy was in a little bitty church out on the edge of town that hadn't grown in years. Chuck was only been there a couple of months, and he had never really been in a church for that many years. He had gone up the ladder, so to speak, and had been in many prominent churches. And Tracy had spent his ministry in that little church for 38 years. He'd been those folks' pastor. They were opposite. They didn't seem to click. But Tracy came in and said this to Chuck. He said, I just came by to hold your hand. I've heard about your news, and I want to pray with you. And so he took Chuck by the hand, and he had a prayer for him. And then they sat in silence for quite a while. And Tracy stood up and walked out. And as he was walking out the door, he turned, he looked back at Chuck, and he said, whatever you do, don't forget the hymn. And Chuck said, what hymn? And Tracy said, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe this far, and grace will lead me home. Tracy and Chuck, despite all of their differences, different theological perspectives, came together that day as great friends. In years later, when Tracy was in the hospital towards the end of his life, Chuck went to see him and said, I'm here to hold your hand and to have a prayer with you and to remind you not to forget the hymn, for grace will lead you home. You see, true friends prioritize their friends' needs. It doesn't matter if it is inconvenient to be a friend. True friends will set their schedules aside and will go and to be with those who are in need. Jonathan didn't care what was going on in his household. He went out to David. He went out to see his friend. He went out to be with his friend and to make a pledge with him. Mothers can teach us so much. Many of you were at Mary Lib Causey's funeral last week, and I shared a story there that I think is apropos to friendship and to prioritizing others' needs. Richie Causey, Mary Lib's son, was in high school, and he wanted to win an award, and it was a particular award called the Mark Durham Award. He wanted to win the Mark Durham Award because he knew the Durham family, and Mark had been an older person when Richie was young. He was in high school, and Richie had looked up to him because Mark was vivacious. He was an actor and a singer, and Richie thought, he's just that kind of person that I'd like to be. And unfortunately, Mark passed away, and so the family established this award for a high school senior, and Richie said, I just want that award. I want to be like Mark. Richie didn't get the award. The award went to a young man named Kyle Matthews. Some of you may have heard of Kyle Matthews. He's a pastor. He's a contemporary Christian singer. Kyle Matthews was a lot like Mark Durham. Richie was down, and Mary Lib, his mom, came to speak to him and said, "Son, I know you're upset about not getting that award, but let's think through this. You know Kyle, don't you?" "Yes." "Tell me a little bit about him." "Well, he's real outgoing. He's an actor. He's a singer." He said, "And does that sound like somebody you know?" He said, "It sounds exactly like Mark Durham was." And Mary Lib said to Richie, "Well, don't you think maybe he was the one that was really supposed to have that award? There are other awards, son, that will highlight you and your distinctiveness. But that award was for Kyle. And he's your friend, and he doesn't even know the Durhams, but you know them. So why don't you go and take Kyle and introduce him to Mark's parents?" Rich told me that was a hard thing for him to do. It was a humbling thing, and yet his mother told him that his friends' needs were more important than even his own needs. Those who are true friends to us will help us restore our faith. They will remind us of God's providence, that God has something for us. When Jonathan went out to visit David, he told him this. He said, "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." Jonathan says, everybody knows you're going to be the king. And I too will even bow down to you, even though he was the rightful heir. Providence, what God has in store for us. Jonathan is saying to his friend David, God's got this. It may look like everything's wrong because you're out here in the desert and you don't know what to do, and yet God is still in charge. We all need those friends that look into our life and remind us that God has something special for us. You probably don't know this, but my father didn't want me to be a pastor. It wasn't that he really didn't want me to be a pastor. He was just worried about me being a pastor. He was proud of me when I felt called to ministry. He was very encouraging to me, but when I was young, he wasn't really sure about it. I asked Dad one time later on in life, I said, "Dad, I know you kind of discouraged that when I was young. Was that because you want to make sure I was called?" He said, "No, because you're too nice." He said, "Church can be a mean place sometimes. I've been a pastor for a long, long time, and I don't want you to get hurt." He was loving me that way. My mom, however, had a different view of pastors. She wanted me to be a pastor because her grandfather, my great-grandfather, who we called Big Papa, was a Methodist minister in South Georgia. His name was G.W. Bates. He was a minister during the Great Depression. Pastor Bates, my great-grandfather, was the one who helped the folks in the community through the Depression. Because he was a pastor, he got extra gas rations. He could drive his car when other folks couldn't, and so he was the one that went and got the folks that needed to go to the doctor or the hospital and took them there. He was the one who went and got groceries for folks and took them to their home. He was the one who showed great love and care. And my mama used to tell me stories about my great-grandfather. And he used to say, "That's what a pastor is, Nelson. God will always provide for you if you do God's work." You don't have to be afraid of this call. You see, true friends remind us not to fear. The very first word out of Jonathan's mouth to David was, "Do not fear. Do not worry." You know, we learn our fear responses from our friends. Did you know that? Psychologists have studied this, and when we're young, yes, our parents teach us this too, but when we get old enough that we have our friends become very influential in how we respond to things. And if there's a group of kids they get anxious and scared, and they feed off of one another. They get even more anxious and scared. But if there's at least one of them that can show some courage, it will change the dynamics of the whole group. I've seen this happen. I used to work with Boy Scouts, and I remember we were out at Slide Rock State Park in Sedona, Arizona. And I watched a group of boys. We were out there, and they'd all slid down the rocks, and they went down to where the pool is at the bottom. If you go down there, there are some cliffs on the side. And there's 3 different levels you can jump from. They all jumped from the first one. That was fine. And they got to the second one, and a few of them jumped, and got to the third one, and I just watched them. They looked at each other. You jump. No, you jump. No, you jump. And while these 4 or 5 boys were talking, I'll never forget, David Brooks just jumped right off. He just did it. He just jumped. And after he did, the rest of them went. I went too. I thought I was brave, but about halfway down, I remember I had to pay for my kids' college and thought, I'm never doing this again. But it was just that one kid that had some courage. And it changed the dynamics of the whole group. Friends come into our lives and say, don't fear. Don't be so anxious. God is with us, because they remind us that we are not alone. Don't you need a friend every once in a while just to come and sit with you and say, hey, you're not by yourself in this? And maybe every once in a while you need to be that friend that goes to someone else and says, you're not by yourself in this. I was very anxious when I was young, usually around the time school started. I don't know why, but the first day of school always made me anxious. I wasn't sure what was going to go on or what was going to happen. And I remember when I was in those young grades, kindergarten and first grade and second grade, and I would be anxious. I couldn't sleep. My mom would come and bring a chair into my room and sit with me and talk with me. And she'd say, Nelson, now, you're not going to be alone tomorrow. Let's think about this. The kids that live up the street, they're going to school for their first day tomorrow. The kids that live down the street, they're going to school for the first day tomorrow. And believe it or not, the teachers are going to school for the first day with the kids. No one's going to be alone. You're all going to be there. My mom was a school teacher. Maybe that's why she knew this stuff, but I think back now about that probably being the worst night that she would have to stay up with an anxious child. The night before she would have to teach several hundred kids the next day. And yet she didn't want me to be alone. Friends rely on one another. You know that friendship is a covenant. A covenant is a holy agreement. When Jonathan went out to David, they established another covenant. They'd already established one covenant. Jonathan had actually given all of his armor to David and said that I will follow you. And now that there is a brink of a civil war in Israel, with some following Saul and some following David, Jonathan comes out and makes a covenant. He makes an alliance with his father's foe, but his friend, and renews the covenant. I used to watch a Presbyterian worship service sometimes when I lived in Atlanta. There was a really good pastor down there. Not only did he preach really good sermons, but he did really good baby dedications. He would take that child and he'd walk them down the aisle, and that's where I found that from. I love to walk the kids up and down the aisle and introduce them to church, and he would say something like this. He would say, you are a child of the covenant. You know, Presbyterians talk about covenant more than we do. And every time he did, I thought, well, I wish my kids were children of the covenant. I wish I was a child of the covenant. And I was talking to a Presbyterian friend one day, and I said, you know, y'all have this wonderful thing. You say that your children are children of the covenant. And he looked at me and said, Nelson, you're a child of the covenant too. And so are your kids. This covenant is made through our Lord Jesus Christ, through his blood. And you're his child, and therefore you are a child of the covenant. We need to see that there are others out there who are children of God's covenant. And therefore we covenant with them. we make agreement with them to be their friends as well, and we adapt when needed, even our schedules. Jonathan could have stayed in that palace, but he was adaptive. He went out into the desert. I'll never forget talking to a woman. She wasn't that old, she wasn't that young, but her husband had passed away. And we were talking, and she said, you know, I'm having difficulty because all of my friends are couples. And when we go out, it feels like I'm a third wheel, and it just doesn't feel quite right. I just wish I had some friends at my age who I can just go out and do something with the girls maybe. I said, well, maybe that will happen. She called me the next day and said, Nelson, remember what we were talking about yesterday? I said, yeah, I do. She said, well, my friend Mary called me that very afternoon after we talked, and she said this to me. She said, I know when you go out with me and Fred, it feels a little awkward, and I tell you what, Fred's fine to stay by himself. Let's go out and do something just the two of us for a change. Her friend adapted to her and her needs, just like Jonathan was willing to change his very life for his friend David. You see, friends stay faithful despite whatever the circumstances are in our life. Jonathan could have said to David, well, you're out there hiding in the desert, too bad. Just go on and run away, but he didn't. David was in poor straits. Saul was after him. His life was being threatened. True friends walk in when the rest of the world walks out. True friends don't just walk away. It's like the kid who brought a bag of candy to school. He had a lot of friends at recess all of a sudden, till the candy ran out. And when it was gone, they all were going away and playing on their own. He looked at his buddy Tommy, and Tommy looked at him, and he said, Tommy, all the candy's gone. And Tommy said, I was here before there's any candy. They were already friends. It's not about the circumstances of life. Friendship is something that is deeper. In fact, friendship is something that will inspire us from generation to generation. Darnell Robertson, Mary Forbes, and Beth Jenkins. Those names mean absolutely nothing to you. But they were my mother's best friends. I couldn't escape them. Miss Robertson was my middle school math teacher and my mom's best friend. If I made a poor grade, my mama knew. And Miss Robertson said, Nelson, you can do better than this. Mary Forbes had 4 boys of her own, Ronnie, Randy, Ryan, and Rodney, all ours. Their house was full, but there was always a place for one more in her house, and she was glad to have me around. Beth Jenkins taught Sunday school. She taught us vacation Bible school. She was there Wednesday nights. I remember several times Miss Jenkins getting on to me about this or that. And I wanted to say, Miss Jenkins, you're not my mama. But I knew she was. She had all the authority of my mom as her best friend. After my mother passed away, sometimes I felt as if I were alone. And then I remembered Miss Robertson and Miss Forbes and Miss Jenkins were still around. And I could call on any of them today, and they would give me motherly advice. You see, friendship is something that can bless generation to generation. Jonathan was killed. David became king. David brought in his advisors. And David said to them, is there anyone left in my friend Jonathan's family to whom I might show kindness? His advisor says, there's one. Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was just a boy, and his nursemaid, fleeing from David, thinking that this is the last heir, he will surely be killed, fell and dropped him and broke his legs. And Mephibosheth was crippled from that moment on. David heard about Jonathan's last living son, and he said, "Go and get him and bring him into the palace, for he is now my son." You don't realize the power of friendship, but true friends make a difference that goes on and on and on.